I'm Will. I'm going to be talking through this a bit today, looking at a couple of questions, looking at some interesting points. I'm creative director and head of innovation at Qld Creative, which is essentially just a job title that says I look at creative problems and get to play with interesting stuff. Now, Qld Creative as a company, we do cutting edge single multi-user digital experiences, brands and organizations, including AR, VR, MR, XR, all of that, which again is just another way that to say that we found an opportunity to play with interesting brands and try and create things that they hadn't got before. So that ranges from educational technology to medical technology, to entertainment, to cultural storytelling, to interactive events of all shapes and sizes. That's given us an opportunity to work with a range of brands around the world, including Seuss and Aardman, but also UK government and Hyundai, BBC, and more recently with Ubisoft, helping bring Assassinins Creed Valhalla to life. And that's one of the things that I'm going to touch on later. We've been fortunate enough to receive a number of awards and accolades doing this. Most important by far on that list is the Qld XR Festival.
Yes,
wins
that's
from last year.
We love. Yeah, that's the one we love. Woo.
It's the one that we've got on the top of our shelf.
Yeah,
it looks so good there.
Yeah.
In terms of those beloved brands we're going to touch on today, there are kind of 4 key ones that is going to help kind of explain and elucidate some of the challenges that we've faced. Now, I do want to say we've faced because it's not going to be a dive into the entire industry, because I don't feel qualified to talk about a lot of what other people have done, but also because we've only got a relatively short amount of time. So we're going to touch on some work with Dr. Seuss, some work with Wallace and Gromit on the big Fix Up and Fix Up the City, that upcoming Assassinins Creed Valhalla City scale AR experience, but also a VR experience that is just about to go live. It's an adaptation of the award-winning children's story Monsters Brawl. Again, bringing in some very unique challenges to XR. So why are we talking about stories? Well, because from locational XR all the way through to intelligent AR, and all the way through into what people are starting now to call the metaverse, which is just layers of information, we're able to tell new types of stories. And in doing so, they come with a hell of a lot of challenges, because anything new, you're stepping into the unknown, really challenging thing to be doing. So from this, you start to go, okay, well, what are these new story forms? How can we go and leverage all of these new opportunities? Well, the first, obviously, and the thing that we're now incredibly all familiar with, courtesy of Disney and their world-conquering attitude, transmedia. How do you build a story world that lets you have media forms that sit inside it, all kind of semi-overlapping, separate to a core form? This sounds kind of abstract, but if we go to the Disney example, you'll have, let's say, Star Wars. Star Wars sits as its core form with the film. You then have the TV shows that overlap. You then have secondary media forms of cartoons that don't really overlap, but exist in the same world. And then you have things like toys that are partly in the story world because they draw from it, and partly inside our world because you can just sit and play with your little TIE fighter.
I know this all too well. I'm a parent of 3 kids, and I pay for the movie. I take them to the movies. I then pay to rent it. Even though I've got countless, Netflix, Prime, you name the subscription service, I've got it, but I still have to somehow pay for said experience. And then I buy the game, I buy the plush toy, and I buy whatever else that comes along. But you
read the graphic novel, you read the book, you then play with the mobile phone game on your way to and from school.
So not just the console game.
It's actually possible, it's possible to stay inside the brand world for almost your entire day.
Absolutely.
To be either carrying or just inside it. And in terms of story, in terms of impact, in terms of money making, if we want to be cynical about it, that's a hugely powerful storytelling tool.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It doesn't have to be brand based though. What's really interesting is that you can apply the same transmedia stuff to the real world. So you can look at the story world as being a segment of our real world, either a place in space. So we could go Brisbane, and you can step into Brisbane in different ways, or it could be a point in history. So we could say, okay, what about the point which was around the abolition of slavery? What's the story there, and how do you have those interweaving moments? Or it could be a created form. So it could be a created world. So as part of the Unbox Festival, we're actually working to build a future. So we worked with Alex McDowell, who was the guy behind building Minority Report's Future World.
Oh, wow.
And said, which is like, if you ever want to go and listen to a genius talk, go and speak to Alex McDowell. He's to have invented essentially the principle by which you not just look at a future, but look at how you build that future as an interconnected world. Genuinely wonderful chap.
Just
yeah. Yeah, just put him in the room. It's great. So that lets you then go, okay, what sort of world is it, and how can you then have stories that sit inside it? So that's at the core of transmedia, and that's why also it's often referred to as mandala, because of those overlapping qualities. Within that, you then go on to, okay, what sort of story do we actually tell? So you got your world, you got your mandala of overlapping things. What does this new generation of stuff let us tell from a story? Well, obviously story stems from narrative. Narrative is king, always will be. But within that, you then need to have narrative informing motivation. That motivation is the key ability to shift from passive to active or explorative. So if you're sat reading a book, you are passively absorbing a narrative. As soon as you're talking about XR, you're taking that narrative and going, okay, I'm not a passive recipient, I'm an active recipient. The thing that I'm engaging with motivates me and then enables my interaction. That interaction in turn can enable progression, which is the mechanism by which the narrative then flows. Solid game principles from back in the day, but with a very, very different flavor now that we're talking about XR. Those stories and that progression get increasingly complex to realize because we now have motivation and interaction and progression as components within the way of seeing a story. So it then becomes a question of how do you break it down? How do you look at a story as not just a single continuous line, but as moments that you're experiencing, and those moments becoming beats around a progressive story. So if you think about how play progresses, you already structure it in your head in this way. So you've got Julius Caesar, Act 2, Scene 3, because that's when a key moment happens.
Absolutely.
You've got that split.
So in our conversation on Friday, you were talking about, and I think I couldn't get out of my head, the use of weather and all the other APIs used. I still can't believe why I didn't think of weather. But I assume like this, all that technologies and all those APIs that you can draw on will also control the story as well. So
yeah,
so environmental.
It's where you can take it outside of people's hands. Yeah, you can go, what is progression? Is it by choice or is it by necessity? So do you have a global event that is weather, say? There's a nice little example that says our story stays the same until something in the real world changes. Yeah, but it could also be the collection of other people's kind of involvement in it.
You couldn't have it like if you had an AR cricket game. Just by I can say AR cricket game. Something that's on weather. You can't actually play it today. It's raining.
Yep.
Yeah. Or the pitch is damp, so the ball, when it's bowled to you, doesn't bounce, or whatever happens at cricket when sunny and it's sandy and whatever else is doing. Oh yeah, so yeah, I could imagine.
Test match game is a great example of a story actually, because every single test match is its own unique story, comprised of days, comprised of moments, comprised of events. Like it's a lovely way to look at story in a different form.
Yeah, because sometimes there is no story, and then all of a sudden there is, because you can be going for 4 days. It's going for a draw. Then on the 5th day, there's magic happens, and then everybody's watching. Fingers crossed.
Yep. That imperative, that tension, and it's not linked to time. It's linked to events and conditions. The time is the thing that is a product of the stuff that's happening.
the trigger, which you can obviously program as a developer. You can obviously program those triggers.
Not wanting to sound too much like a megalomaniac, but it does appeal to the God complex in all of us, because you can set the parameters for your world. You can set how stuff works, what we're waiting on, and it can be what you're defining. So that gets really, really fun in that way. We've also just mentioned chronology and time as a factor. Time is also great to progress between beats, forcing you to either see or just miss moments. So you can make people wait based on real time. So there's some really great games. The name of which has just slipped my mind, in which you are stranded on, well, the character is stranded on an alien planet, and you have to help guide them through a series of choices. You're essentially back at base, you're advising them, and then they're acting. But it takes them time to do things. So you go, okay, why don't you go and investigate that crash site over there? And the chap at the other end goes, okay, I think it'll take me about 3 hours to walk there. Wish me luck. And then it's dead for 3 hours, and you're waiting.
So
which
you're
is
talking about
just magical.
A real-time experience that, because there's often a discussion between, games shouldn't actually take 3 hours, but if you're bringing in realism, but should you, if an AR experience, just for argument's sake, if we're doing a real world experience, a real city experience, say Wallace and Gromit, you want to visit Wallace on the other side of town, the other side of Brisbane, and let's just say it's an hour's walk away. Should you expect Wallace to go from point A to point B in an hour? Or if you drove to that same location, would you expect to see him or her or they at that location by the time you got there? Do you think the same rules of time should apply to a AR, VR?
I think I think the same rules of time can apply. And I think the opportunity here is that you're not constrained by them not applying, that we always assume that it should be delivered because people want it. Now, that's not going to be the most magical thing, is it? Like, if you think about how you experience your day-to-day life, the things which are most impactful are the things that you have to wait for. Anticipation of a thing is often so much more memorable than the thing itself.
Absolutely.
You don't remember going and doing the thing for 20 minutes. You remember wanting to for 2 days before, the expectation. It becomes part of your story. So you then get into some really kind of high-level stuff, which is the story that you're experiencing the story that you're being told, or the story that is your memory of experiencing it?
Right.
Now, humans don't remember the thing exactly. They remember their experience of it. It's all subjective. So you're just creating a story which is to be experienced, which flies against kind of the principles of this is my authored work. I've worked on this for years, don't you know, darling? Which is, and in one way, that's great. And you got to love Virginia Woolf, sat at home going crazy in her bedroom writing these amazing books. But it's very self-centered. And when it comes to experiences like we can create, you can start to be much more user-centered storytelling, going, what is it that my user is going to feel? So you've got a very different shift.
Yeah, it's true, actually. Yeah, I guess the planning of a AR or VR experience is all around who's the target audience. Can you relate to it? Because I mean,
can you do it? Yeah. What happens then? What do you remember? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff we get sent is very hard to relate to. There's often stories that we have no experience in, like we've been brought up a certain way, certain whatever, but the way that they portray it, it's easy to understand because they've thought about how do I relate my story to someone else. And I guess that's the magic of VR. If you nail that, you produce an amazing product like Wallace and Gromit and so forth like that, because it's easy to relate to. It's fun. You've got great voice actors. You've got great animators, good production, all that type of thing. And obviously you've got a good thought process with what you've got on screen, how you've thought all the way through, and how the interaction with the user and what the story is going to be, the journey that you're going to take them on. It's all about storytelling and making sure that message gets across, I guess.
Yeah, it is. And if you do it well, it works. And you're constantly fingers crossed throughout the whole thing, because that subjectivity means that you're dealing with an unknown. You're really wrestling with it. That wrestling with it actually is something that is a product of agency and choice. If I could know exactly what all people were going to do well before they did it, I'd be living on a yacht more alongside Bezos, but
Nice.
it would make it would make my life an awful lot easier, because as soon as you're starting to tell a story where they can move themselves, where they can choose their interactions, you're giving people agency. And if you're going to realize immersion, just like we've been talking about, you should have some of that. Now, it doesn't have to be real. And again, you start to sound a little bit cynical, but so long as the impact is genuine, it doesn't really matter. So on the right-hand side of the diagram, you can actually see an interaction that has two outcomes, both of which then go back to a central thread that then lead to the end. It doesn't make any difference. You go from interaction, you go to the endpoint. At its most basic example, do you pick up the red hat or the blue hat to wear? You still get shot. You just get shot wearing a blue hat or a red hat.
It's good analogy.
Completely irrelevant.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true. Yeah.
But it makes you feel so much more engaged. So it's that value that you have of being part of a thing that, again, XR is unique for, because it's enabling you to combine choice into reality and into experiences. You're never going to feel truly invested in a character in a book unless you are, pretending to be them in some way. But you imagine you add in choice into that, you've got a quality that wasn't there. That's not to say that the book is not a fantastic story. I mean, you've got guys sat up in bell towers courtesy of reading Catcher in the Rye, but if you can then add in different layers to tell stories in different ways, you're able to have a very different experience. And I think that difference of experience is what we need to focus on as an industry.
So the person before you, Nick, who was fabulous, he came from the console, sort of console / arcade background, and his point of view was, and I'm paraphrasing him, if I get it wrong, Nick, I apologize. He found it difficult, the thought of AR taking over, say, a console, for replacing a console. What's your point of view on that? Do you see like the interaction that you're planning on giving an end user soon replacing, or one day replacing a console or a mobile phone, or working alongside a mobile phone being AR?
So it's a really interesting question. And my response to, because I've been asked that a number of times, my response is pretty much always the same of, have you ever listened to anything on the radio?
Yeah. Not so much.
You know that TV exists, right?
Yeah.
And you know that film exists,
Yeah.
right? And you go, hold on a minute. It's not a question of replace. Each thing carries its own unique quality.
Gotcha.
And those qualities are the thing that makes it magical. I would quite happily have an old school games console, a really early Kong joystick, 2 buttons, in my living room if I could, because of the uniqueness of that experience, the standing, the way in which you're playing with it, the way in which you are connecting to that game and that experience, the emergent storytelling that comes back to me of like the complexity of the no saving, all of the rest of it. AR does something different. Different doesn't mean better. Different doesn't mean replace. Different just means different. Gotcha. You're able to tell different stories. Certainly that's how I would always see it. Now things become ubiquitous. Like we will have glasses. They will become ubiquitous. They will be a facet of our everyday lives, which we will then be able to generate content for. Doesn't mean the other stuff won't exist. You only have to look at bookshelves.
Absolutely correct. Yeah.
It's actually something that I'm going to touch on a little bit more later, because we're talking about Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss is a phenomenal example of a book which is drawn and then written in a very book form. And then how do you adapt that to be in AR? All of what we're talking about goes on to some steel thread principle, which I'm just going to gloss over, because it is essentially see all of the previous bits above of like, you got to connect all of this into one great big mesh. And it's very key that you don't lose the central thread of a story, because people are lazy. People have short attention spans, and you need to give them the thing if they choose to. Again, I come across as massively cynical,
That's true.
But the flip side is like, how many times have you gone, oh, come on, just explain it already.
No, you're right. You are 100% correct. Yeah. It's why
human nature.
That's why pay to win or pay to play games do so well. This is like, I can skip it to the end where I win if I pay $5 or $10. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The lovely example, not from inside games at all, is actually coffee. You ask a focus group, what coffee do you want? Every single one of them says, oh, I like my coffee rich and dark and intense. You blind taste test the same group. They always go for something kind of middling, slightly sweet and not too strong. Because people's expectation of what they want and what they convince themselves they want is often then undermined by, oh, actually, I'll be quite happy not to explore all the side content because the main content is the bit, and that's fine. I don't pay to jump ahead. Thanks. Because people are people.
Sure.
All of this, and actually going back to the console thing, emergent storytelling, not what is the story, but what is the environment in which I am experiencing the story as a person, as me, and then how does my unique experience become the story that I have and that I then share. That can be something you enhance with content. So, I mean, the master of this by far, Fallout 3. Number of times you have conversation going, did you ever see the blah, 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 blah? It doesn't matter what it was, because you found a thing that no one else had found, you experienced it in a certain way. That unique story is your emergent story, not somebody else's.
It's the advantage of AR, VR. It's the unique story. Gotcha. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
So let's dive into a couple of applications, examples of this. Dr. Seuss. We created Dr. Seuss's ABC, amazing AR alphabet. First time Dr. Seuss's characters and a book had ever been rendered out into AR. First time their characters had ever been rendered into 3D. Now, the experience itself focused on how do you enrich a book. Okay, so we recreated the book. You could place the book in AR in front of you, it would land, and then you would be able to hear the rhyme, read the rhyme, because it was fundamentally about children's learning of letters and language. What can't a book do? Well, it can't let you practice the things that you are understanding. It can't teach you how to draw these letters. So we added in, each page teaches you to draw the letter to then have progression, to then have the characters coming to life from the book. So the book became a point of interaction, became a point of something coming to life that you were then interacting with. It's not to replace the book, to go back to what we were just saying, it's to enrich. So a story exists separate to the form in which it's manifest. So you have the story of Dr. Seuss's ABC, and it becomes a book, or it becomes a digital experience in AR, or it becomes all the rest of it. You see this in the way that we handle film. It's just an extension of that principle. I'm actually going to gloss over this bit and then come back to it if we have time, because I want to just dwell for a moment on that challenge of how do you take characters, beloved characters, because this is where we get to the beloved bit, and then put them into XR, and how incredibly challenging that can be. So on the top, you have Dr. Seuss's drawing of Aunt Annie's alligator. It is a thing with great whimsy. It's a thing of great beauty. And it's a thing of really, really irritating shading and legs that are not the same length and reins that would immediately snap its neck if it tried to extend its mouth, and eyes that seem to be on the side of its head. So factually, utter nonsense, but still beautiful. Yeah, so when you're rendering them as 3D, how do you handle this? How do you stay true to the nature of the character? So this is still, the animation team did an incredible job of bringing this to life. But how do you make it feel like it stepped off the page when it comes into our world? Well, you have to have it shaded. So custom shader engines, ways of making it feel drawn so that you stay true to it. Now, if we remember the Cat in the Hat travesty with Mike Myers, that is not true to the form. Now, I know some people are big fans of it. It does not feel like it's Seuss. It does not feel like it comes from the same place. So that then becomes something that's very, very important with whenever we're handling beloved characters in AO, in XR in general, staying faithful and adapting in a way that is going to both work, but also doesn't lose that core quality. Moving on to Wallace and Gromit's Big Fix-Up, we had similar but different challenges. So it was a transmedia AR game experience that contained comics and sections of film, augmented reality, but also embedded social elements and immersive fake VR, play based on mobile game, and then live AR within city scale spaces. It contained new characters. Now, the absolute terror of having to sit alongside the Aardman creative character team and pitch new characters should not be underestimated.
Oh, I could imagine.
Your heart is jacked because these are people who are absolute masters of their craft. And you've got to sit there and explain why your new characters on the left, Bernard Grubb, fits their tone, their quality, everything that makes Aardman brand so correct. And it comes with a brand value. It comes with a brand quality, similar to Seuss, but incredibly different at the same time. Fortunately for this project, the Aardman team were on hand to go, that's very nice, what a lovely idea. Can we just steer you in the right direction of something slightly better? And it's great. And it takes us on to something I talked about in the last talk, which is make sure you get different types of people in the room, because these experiences require different things.
It's interesting you say about that particular character, because until you, like, I've played your game a million times, and experienced a million times, I've never known that he wasn't, or he or she was not not an original Aardman character. I always thought, just one of the many characters that they've produced. That it would probably shock not only me, but many of the players of the game that is not an original player.
We were fortunate enough to be able to use original characters. You got Wallace, you got Gromit, you've got the Rocket, you've got the Cooker, things that are both inanimate and animate, but still characters. But the challenge, so we had a villain of the piece, which was Bernard, the chap in the suit, and also a kind of heroine, Hackaby, on the right, who helps you. Having to build those characters, making them fit with the world of Wallace and Gromit, but making it fit with the tone is a real challenge, but a beautiful challenge. And it just shows that if you're staying true to brand values and working with the right people, it's something that can be managed. It does have challenges. Now, it's something I mentioned on the last talk, but I think it's worth repeating. Clay. You can't think of Aardman characters without thinking about the fact that they were clay.
Absolutely.
They are clay. Like, you can't get away from that. So for these characters, we actually started with clay maquettes made by the Aardman modeling team. So the characters were then designed on paper, made into clay maquettes, and then scanned with photogrammetry. That photogrammetry was then made into a model, and that model was then rigged and then animated and textured. And if you're going to have your AR characters, we're going to have characters in our world that are still Aardman characters. They have to have a clay-like quality. Now, with Gromit, it's not too bad. A 3-foot clay dog just looks kind of charming. This is not true when it comes to a 6-foot clay Wallace, who is an unrestrained monstrosity. We worked hard to get thumbprints all over him as if he'd been made in the clay and sculpted. Wow. And then this golem, this huge constructed thing is then walking towards you. And there's a deep-seated, the Germans have a word for it, which is unheimlich, which is the familiar and homely, but made unfamiliar. And it's the same thing of, like, if things come to life around you, they just feel wrong. And that deep-seated wrongness is something which we then had to balance. So if you're going to take characters from one environment and put them into our world, super careful that does not create the opposite to the intended effect. We ended up balancing it. We found a way forward, but really challenging.
So if you'd rendered it in, like, I don't know, 3D Max or whatever, straight, rather than going through the photo scanning and so forth, it would have just been too unrealistic. You wouldn't have been able to reproduce that texture, that that.
The texture actually came separately. So we actually built custom shader engines to render thumbprints onto the surface.
Nice.
So we actually went to that much effort, which was then completely wasted, but that's part of the process. The reason why we did it with scanned maquettes rather than just sculpting it is to keep that connectivity to the original clay, to have the authenticity, to go, okay, we could have just had a model and then we could have our modelers just recreate it. But in having that through line, you make sure that those idiosyncrasies of having made it in clay don't get lost, because you just do it in a different way.
Yeah, you could never accurately reproduce it. You'd always, not that I would be able to tell the difference, or I would know the difference of, maybe it's a thumbprint here and there, but you would somehow in your mind know that was 3D modeled rather than a clay. Yeah.
And some of the early models, and obviously there are some things which weren't actually done in clay. So there are some things which were more hard surface or characters. So there are robot pigeons, and they were handled very differently. So it can work, but for really core elements, it's certainly worth looking at the original process and trying to build off it. That does take us on to the continuity of the content. So when you have stuff inside the real world, when you have stuff inside mobile VR, and then you have the same stuff inside cutscenes, these are the same models, just with different levels of detail, different levels of lighting and shading to reflect the different processes, but fundamentally they're the same. So you can, and it's another value of having all the way from clay all the way through, that you have that level of detail and a perfect continuity. So you can have cutscenes where the characters that you are seeing come to life. The upshot of that is when you see them in AR, those slight imperfections, those rough edges, your brain is filling in the gaps because they've seen the smoother one, they've seen the higher res cutscene. So having that through line of content becomes very, very powerful in terms of our ability to tell stories and make them feel real. I mentioned the robot pigeons. Here's an example of them in action. And this is a moment of a secondary experience created inside the story world, which is a flexible and reactive experience. We created using Apple's LiDAR system. We created environmentally aware AR. Now, I talk about this in a bit more detail in the last talk, but just very, very briefly, this lets us know what the room is, lets us know where flat surfaces are, lets us know where walls are and floors are, and then lets the characters that are placed into that room interact with your room specifically. So it's not interact with a fixed thing, it's interacting with a flexible thing. So it doesn't matter if it's in my bedroom or your bedroom, those birds will land on whatever table is available to them. That story potential is huge, because you're not now going, here is our fixed thing. You're going, here are the characters who are suddenly surrounding you doing a thing. And it's magical. Like it gets me every time, because it's just something that I didn't think I'd ever see. So very, very cool and very worth it.
The video, which I think it's birds or pigeons landing on the table.
Right-hand side, they're emerging from a wall, and any wall inside the room it would identify, and then a portal would appear. They come out of that portal. The LiDAR has detected the floor and tables, so flat surfaces that are above the floor, and then the AI of the robot pigeons is telling them under certain circumstances to find a flat elevated surface and then land on it to give it verisimilitude, to give it that realism.
Because when you look at it looks like it's making a definite beeline for that table. It's not like a lot of AR games. It just seems random that it's landed here. Whereas on that example, it looks quite, I've thought about it from a character point of view, and I'm landing on that table. It's not by chance it's landed on the table. It's landed on the chance.
It is by intent.
Yeah, which is
so. This is built inside Unity, and there's a Unity character AI, and that character AI is looking for surfaces that it knows are tables, and looking for surfaces it knows are floors and walls, and it's saying, okay, don't fly into the wall, do look for tables, do look for floors. And then there are timed random events which go, okay, I want to land, and then it drives the intent to land, and then it looks for where it can do so. So they're taught to behave reactive to your room. And in fact, if there were no tables, if it was just in a cube, they would never land because they wouldn't find a table. So they just keep on flying around because they are smart enough to know what the room is.
Oh, that's fantastic. Sorry to interrupt. But
Yeah, no, it's always fun to talk about it because it's thinking about things in a different way. And all of this next gen storytelling is just going, it's the same principle we all played with before. It just gives us a slightly different toolkit to consider. The thing that blows my mind is the fact that this works in any room. And you go, oh, well, of course it does. But you then go, hold on a minute. That's whatever room for whatever person, wherever they are in the world. And it has that uniqueness because your experience of it will be different to mine. So you have that emergent storytelling. And you have the moment where it landed next to that cup. Did you see that? And that's something that you can't author, you can't plan for, but becomes an integral part of that story.
You all have different cups, you all have different tables, you all have different size rooms.
It's very, very personal.
Yeah. Fantastic.
I'm just going to jump ahead to Monsters Brawl VR. So it's a new experience that we're creating at the moment. It is set to launch later in the year. It is an example of a story taken from book to VR. So it's an award-winning children's book. The VR experience takes and adapts the core of the story to VR that creates an experience that evolves the story into a new form. So as we were talking about before, you have your story and you have the idea that the book is a manifestation of it. And then you have another form. So in this case, it's VR. That comes with opportunities. So when you are, especially with a children's book, you're imagining a space. That space is a thing that you would play in if you could. So in this case, there is a graveyard in Halloween Town. When you're reading the kid's book as a child, you would go, oh, I would do that. I'd go and play with the pumpkin man. Because that's what you do. That's how your imagination works. So you're able to take those aspects and really put them to the fore. So you can see here that you're able to pick up these slightly living pumpkins and throw them around as one of the things that you can just do. So you can still have that progression, all the rest of it. Obviously, it stays true to the characters, similar to the work of Seuss. And the key here is that adapting is not just visual, but also it becomes tonal. So it's an incredibly playful, fun book. So you can see on the right, one of the test animations we did is a pumpkin-headed man and an ogre doing a little fist bump. It's trying to keep that tone in everything you do. It also contains within it the potential to do incredible new things when it comes to accessibility. So this book was written in English, published in English. The digital VR version of this will have the ability to swap the language of the words that appear on the screen, because it still contains those book-like elements of being able to read it, being able to progress by turning pages. You will have the narrator speaking in one language, the words on the screen in a language. These don't have to be the same, and you're able to change them into different things. Additionally, so obviously you've massively increased your marketplace, so it can now go around the world simultaneously and easily, but also when it comes to learning languages. So smaller languages, often indigenous languages, you can say it becomes a learning tool. You're listening to it, say in English, and the publisher for this book is actually based in Wales, so you'll be able to read it in Welsh. And it's all about engaging and enriching an experience in unexpected ways. This will also be, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying, the first Oculus story experience that supports British Sign Language as an equitable language. So you'll be able to choose to see also BSL throughout. You'll be able to then have the book in BSL form. So if you are a BSL user, you get to use it in your first language. Because unlike a book, you can do hand tracking. We're developing a system that actually then builds this into a BSL language form. So you'll be able to see the character sign, and you'll be able to hear the BSL because of you're able to see it. that accessibility, that for me is so exciting, because you're not stuck by the limits of the previous form. You're able to really embrace that, and it's one of the cool things about XR.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I can imagine just if, and obviously a global trend at the moment is being more open-minded, being more
inclusive.
Inclusive. Yeah, for want of a better term. Yeah, inclusive. And I can imagine like kids being exposed to BSL who would otherwise not be exposed to BSL, especially it's a game. They will even just to have a bit of fun. They will probably try BSL. And it might resonate with them. It may not resonate with them, but at least it gives them an exposure to something that otherwise wouldn't be exposed to. And if they had a BSL kid in their class,
it's no longer alien. It's not weird. It's not foreign. It's normalizing.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is one of the weird things I learned doing the research around this, is that one of the largest populations in terms of social demographic that actually speak sign in the US is actually a prison population, because there's a really amazing initiative whereby prisoners are taught sign to be able to come out as translators when they get released. And the upshot of this was that the prisoners really started to reassess what it meant for them to have abilities and to engage with communities they've never engaged with. That kind of humility and shared language thing, apparently enormous positive benefits beyond here's a skill that you can commercialize. So yeah, really interesting kind of secondary effects from it.
Wow.
We talked earlier about how do you structure things into beats and acts. When you are building a book into VR, that gets really, really, really important, because your transitions and your moments of play and your interactions become key components. So we built a system to handle it. In the same way that we built a system to handle the narrative structure of Big Fix Up, we built a node system, which we've called Project V, to handle storybook into VR. So you can see in these rather small images on the right that you are building, you're taking your storybook and then you build nodes and beats, and inside beats, moments of interaction, and you're able to preset all of these. So you've got a structure that you can work with authors and go, okay, how does your book feel if it's in a different form? Which is a really exciting opportunity to then kind of structure and codify the processes of taking stories into forms. I'm just going to check time. Okay, I'm actually going to skip a little bit through Fix Up the City. Fix Up the City, Wallace and Gromit, geolocated experience, 3 physical locations, Cardiff, Bristol, and San Francisco. You went there, you could experience city scale AR. Talked about this in more detail in the last talk, but key principle is you are scanning your environment, but you're not really scanning it. You are letting your phone see the environment, and then that is comparing it to a known value for that environment, and therefore placing where you are. And as a result of that, it can place content into the world around you. So you can see here the first mission in the Fix Up the City, in which Wallace is explaining to you that there is a robot on the loose, big lad, and he's emerging from the ground in front of you and then walking around the building, because it knows where that building is, and you can be anywhere inside a 1 block radius. We direct you to a location, but it then happens organically around you. Incredibly fun way of telling a story with AR. It has challenges, and I do want to dwell on those challenges, because you've got digital content in a theatrical space with a moving audience who can look in any direction, and it requires a different way of thinking about it. Normally AR, we have the mindset of I am the center of the world, and then stuff is happening around me. Here you're in a much more theatrical space where I am part of the world, but I am part of it, not the center of it. The world is the world. And then it's making sure you handle that. And some other new considerations that come with that. I'm only going to dwell on one, which is, because of time, which is on the right-hand side of this image, there is a government building. So being hyper mindful that if you are directing your audience to engage with a physical space. You do not want people with guns coming out of government buildings and going, "Excuse me, sir, what on earth are you doing?" Which is something we had to deal with in this. And as one of the early playtesters, going, hello, Mr. Officer, sir, I'm building a game. And then the eyebrows go up and they say, "Really?" And then, "Yeah, sure, whatever you say. Can I see your ID?" And then you pretty much have to put it in their hands and go, "Okay, can you put the gun down, take my mobile phone, have a look at this cool robot?" Because that's the only way to do it.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously in that case, fortunately, they were big Wallace and Gromit fans because we were in the UK, and they went, "Oh, this is amazing. When is it coming out?" And then you get over it, but it teaches you, think about your space so that you engage with them in advance. So lots of considerations, theatrical ones, so get some theatre people on board, but also practical ones. Don't fall in the water. Do remember where things are, and do remember about government buildings. I wanted to touch on the challenges and excitement that we have for the Valhalla City experience that we're currently creating. So obviously it's a big brand, it's a big story. They are beloved characters in the extreme. This experience will be taking everything we've learned with Wallace and Gromit and the Big Fix Up, and we'll be dialing it up to 11. We are going to be taking Winchester, a central city of the Assassin's Creed Valhalla game, and we're going to be bringing it to life with city scale AR. You will be able to step into the period after Alfred the Great defeated the Vikings. That happens at the end of the game. And you'll be able to explore the city and see game assets, so actual parts of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, into our world. The first time that Ubisoft game assets have ever been outside of the game into our world, and we are super excited to be able to bring it to life. There's a limit to what I can say about what the story is going to contain, but what I can say is that it's going to be rooted in Valhalla. So it's Valhalla's history, but also it will have a central through narrative, and it will build on the Assassin's Creed stories that we know and love. I can also say that it's going to be connected to other physical events that are not digital as well. So there'll be opportunities to bridge all the way from inside the game world, all the way through to crossover points, all the way through to real, which is a fantastic opportunity to tell a story. The challenge is history. Oh, how I do love history, and Assassin's Creed history in particular. This is the absolutely incredibly beautiful Winchester Cathedral that you scale in the game, that you go and murder within. One tiny problem is that it never looked like this at all. Or at least not until 300 years later. And even then it wasn't really quite like this. So it's historical, but it's history-ish. Now, you take that and you put it into our world. How do you handle that challenge? How do you handle the historians and the people with anorexic clipboards going, "Well, I think you'll find that the bell tower during that era was slightly shorter"?
They exist in Australia as well. I've just, you probably assumed that, but I can confirm they exist here. Yeah.
People who've forgotten what fun feels like.
Yeah.
But
I can imagine you'll be up against that. Yeah.
You do, but you have to approach it. You have to deal with it, and you have to engage with it. So it's rooted in history, but it's also part of a fun story, and letting people move seamlessly in and out, saying, "Okay, if you really want to know more, step further into the fact of it, that yes, this talks about how important cathedrals were, but also that they were huge edifices to power. And maybe this one is a slight exaggeration, but why don't you take a look in these areas and go and look at it?" The master of that, and one of my absolute key parts of why I love history, is the author Bernard Cornwell. He was the guy who wrote the Sharp books, set in the Napoleonic War, great stories, proper boys' own adventures. At the end of every book, he had a chapter on the history of it and said, "Okay, this is where I lied. This is what actually happened. If you want to know more, go and learn from these historians." And that balance, super, super fun. It also then takes us nicely onto another great thing that you can do, both as a positive and as a challenge. You can see here Winchester's Nunnaminster, one of the other locations that you're going to in the experience. And you can see in an early test scene on the right-hand side what it looks like when it's in the real world. So it is true real size. You are seeing it not as kind of a gamey feel, but placed into our world, looking up at it, all of its majesty, and you go, this is a beautiful, powerful thing. And that scale, so important for storytelling, but also a real challenge because you have expectations that come with that. You probably are all familiar, I know you are, Matt, with the Ubisoft pyramids from Assassin's Creed. They had to change them, even though they were in game, because pyramids are really small. I don't know if you've been to Egypt, they're small. They're big for the time, but they're small for us now. And the same thing happened when they're filming Gladiator. They made the CG version of the gladiatorial arena exactly historically accurate, and people went, it's tiny. And of course it's tiny. Cities were small back then. So they had to make it closer to a major international stadium.
Right. I never
because
thought of
people
that.
went, this looks wrong, because they have an expectation of what big is.
Yeah, because if you're a massive actor, like not that The Rock was in it, but like a physically strong human, and you're too big for the environment, then the movie
Big
will
for the
fail.
doors.
Yeah,
But also we're used to seeing 800,000 people stadiums, like big stadiums. And I think I'm right in saying that the Colosseum in Rome only sat 4,000 or 5,000.
Oh wow!
It was not. It's a tiny space. And you go, well, what was the population? Well, the population, I think the population during that period was somewhere closer to a couple of 100,000. So we're not talking like a multi-million person city. We're talking a small city or a large town, and the kind of social spaces that they'd have. So you've got physical stuff, but you've also got social stuff in there.
So if you kept 100% true, it would destroy the game or the environment or the movie or whatever you're doing. Right, gotcha.
It's that, and that question of scale is where you have to go back to your history-ish. Now, we're going to be pretty accurate because we're in a period where it kind of works, but it poses a huge opportunity, but also a really interesting set of challenges and questions for your storytelling. All of that combined takes us on to some of the potential. I've got one last kind of wrap-up thought around the potential, which has nothing to do with games or storytelling in a kind of fun and playful way, and has everything to do with the fact that these new types of stories, embedding them in world spaces, letting them react to the environment, being metaversal in terms of layering them into our world, the fact that you can have interaction, free exploration, the fact that you can have people affecting other people inside environments. The main thing that excites me is the fact that you can have a more diverse set of stories than ever before. You're able to look at what these stories tell us about our culture and about the people living inside it, and we're able to engage with those stories and tell different stories in a way that we've never been able to. And that's going to challenge what we think about culture, what we think about the stories we tell ourselves about where we're from. So I think we're entering a really interesting era when it comes to storytelling.
Yeah, we definitely are. It's just even the stuff you're showing me in the slides deck so far. You can see the change. You can see the changes coming.
Yeah, and I think it's only going to be a good one because you start to give storytellers more tools, and they start to build more and interesting stuff. And I think XR is undeniably going to be the absolute vanguard of that. And it's a huge responsibility. It's a huge opportunity, and it's stuff that very soon will move away from big brands and big entertainment IPs and start to be much more embedded cultural questions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Will. That has been a fantastic presentation. Like, you started the conference off, or the festival off so well, and you finished it incredibly well. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you,
from us and the team. We are over the moon with your contribution, and I will let you go. But thank you very much.
Amazing.
Cheers, mate.
Have a great day. Thanks, Matt.
See ya.
Bye-bye.